Okay, I think we can begin. So Evelyn, please share your slides. Good evening, everyone, if you're joining from the UK, and hello for everybody else if you're joining us from abroad. This is the second session on our webinar series, Weird and Wonderful World of Children, Explained by Psychological Research. My name is Dr. Teemu Toivainen, and I'll be hosting the webinar series. And the webinar is organized by the Developmental and Educational Research Group at the Department of Psychology in Goldsmiths, University of London. And the main aim of the webinar is to discuss findings from the psychological research that are an interest of parents or anyone else who's interested in developmental psychology. So the sessions will include a short presentation from a researcher, followed by 20 minutes or approximately 20 minutes of discussion. And please make sure that your mic is muted during the presentation. You can keep your camera on if you're comfortable. And you can, of course, post any questions in the chat, and I'll make a note of them. And then we can leave the questions in the end, where you can also raise them aloud. And today's session is delivered by Dr. Evelyn Mercure, who's a lecturer at the department, and Evelyn will talk about multilingualism. So, floor is yours, Evelyn.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me fine?
Perfect.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so welcome to this session. It's nice to see a lot of familiar names, some from Goldsmith, other from elsewhere in England, and also I see some names from Germany. So welcome everybody. So today I'm going to talk about bilingualism and multilingualism in general. This is something that is a strong interest of mine from both a personal and a professional perspective. So from a professional perspective, I trained as a speech and language therapist, but I never actually worked as a therapist because I fell in love with research in neuroscience and went on to study neuroscience and psychology. And I've been doing research, especially on early development, with a strong focus on different types of language experiences and how they can impact neurocognitive development later on. I also have a personal interest in bilingualism. As I'm sure you can hear, I'm a bilingual myself. And as I'm sure you can hear as well, I'm a late bilingual. So that's the reason why I have a French accent when I speak English. I'll come back to that during the talk, trying to explain a little bit this phenomenon of the foreign accent. From a personal point of view, I've also had the chance of watching 3 bilingual children grow up and learn. So I have 3 children who have been exposed to French and English from birth. And following their learning journey has been very informative and fascinating for me. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk a lot more about the types of bilinguals that are more like my children. So we call them crib bilinguals. So children who are exposed to their 2 languages or 3 languages from the time of birth. So not so much will be discussed about late bilinguals like myself. So traditionally, the field of bilingualism has been portrayed very much in black and white. Historically, it was mostly this kind of negative perspective that was projected about bilingualism. It's still very widespread, especially in some countries. This idea that if you are bilingual, you are having a non-optimal experience, that the child is going to pretty much inevitably fall behind in school, etc. So this idea focused very much on the deficits that may be associated with second language learning. And then more recently, there's a more positive light shed on bilingualism, but it is also very much in a black and white kind of way, because it claims that bilingualism makes you smarter. So it is this positive light that is not, in my opinion, entirely realistic. And the truth is probably a bit of both. There are some disadvantages to being bilinguals, also some great advantages. But being generally smarter is probably not one of them. So we'll come back to this and try to discuss a more balanced view of bilingualism. So how did we end up with such a polarized view of bilingualism? I think it is through this idea of viewing language development through a monolingual lens. What I mean by that is that most of what we know about language development comes from studying monolinguals. So, and not any kind of monolinguals in what we call in research a weird environment. So here weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic countries. A disproportionate amount of what we think we know about language development comes from studying monolingual English-speaking children. And very often, any other type of experience is considered as, often implicitly, but considered as a deviation from this norm. And that's how we can portray things in a black and white way. But such a focus on monolingualism is not necessarily healthy or a representative way of seeing the world, because about half of the world population is functionally bilingual. And most of the world's bilingual have acquired their languages as native languages. So they are what I referred to earlier in the talk as crib bilinguals. We can even say that monolingualism is nearly non-existent in many communities around the world. So there's no reason to have this disproportionate focus on monolingual language development. So going back to language learning, if you attended Casper Ademann's webinar a few months ago, so the first one of the series, he explained really well that human babies are born very premature. So their brain is not fully formed. And this explains why it takes them a whole year to learn to walk, for example. But the positive aspect of this is that the human brain develops with a lot of input from the environment. And in terms of language development, the input itself, especially in the earlier phases of development, is critically important. So the type and kind of experience, the amount of experience that the baby receives in terms of language early on, while the brain is still shaping a system to process language, will make a very big difference to the child's ability to process and learn languages later on. So what do I mean by a rich language experience here? So there are two main aspects. The first one is the quantity of the language. And this is mainly the language that is addressed to the child. We have a lot of data showing that children learn a lot better when using a signal that is addressed to them compared to when they're learning using language that is overheard in their environment. So this is the quantity aspect. The quality aspect has nothing to do with having a posh accent. It is more about the variety of the language that is presented to the child. So how many different words, how many different grammatical structures. So this kind of quality and variety in the language is the kind of input that will create a great language learning machine as the brain is developing. And this input can be in any language. It can be in 2 languages. It can be in 3 languages. Here, what matters is the quantity and the quality. So immigrant and expat families often need to make a decision about the language that they'll be using with their child. And sometimes they're pressurized or feel pressurized to use the language that the child will be using at school. But if we think especially about the quality of the input, it may be more productive for the immigrant family and the immigrant parents and expat parents to actually use their native language with their child to create this strong language base. They're more likely to provide a rich input in their native language compared to the language of the majority that perhaps they don't master as well. So to just emphasize this idea of the impact of early language experience, I just wanted to take a little detour to show you some data about deaf adults. So here we know from studying deaf adults that those adults who experience less language in their early environment. So here I'm thinking about deaf adults who were born into a hearing family where the language that is used in the family is not fully accessible to them. So these deaf adults will struggle to learn a language later on in adulthood, whether it is a spoken language or a sign language. And this is compared to deaf adults who grew up in a deaf family where sign language was being used. So they had this early period of input of sign language. And it is also compared to deaf adults who could hear early on, but acquired a hearing impairment later on. So it is these few years of early experience while the brain is shaping that is extremely important still in adulthood. So this strong language base will help you understand and process language, but also learn a new language, whether it is a spoken or sign language. But it goes also beyond language itself. It helps understand the world, because as the child is learning words, they're also learning the concepts that go with these words. So for a young child to learn the word cat, it's not just about learning the sound, it's also learning what this category of animals is and how they differ from dogs or from cows or from inanimate objects. This strong language base also helps you understand other people's thoughts, beliefs, and emotions. So a lot of this is processed using body language. But to be able to read this body language, we know that language is involved in the learning of the associations of body language with thoughts, beliefs, and emotions. And also, a strong language base also helps structure your own thoughts, because you have this inner voice that is helping you in this process to solve problems, for example. So we've talked about early experience, but what are the elements that are important for early experience? Language is a complex structure. It's a hierarchical structure from small unit to much bigger ones. So I'm going to talk about a few of the elements, starting with a smaller unit, so the speech sounds. People around the world have the same anatomy for producing speech, but we tend to, so every language around the world uses a different set of sounds in the language to produce words. And this is here the International Phonetic Alphabet that's created a notation for every kind of sound that can be created using a human vocal tract. What is interesting here is that newborns are actually better than adults at processing differences between all of these sounds. Because what happens is that newborns can process any differences here, but as the baby is learning the sound system of their native language or their native languages, they're learning to chunk these sounds. So to create categories of sound that are contrasted between each other to create words. And it's especially in the second part of their first year that they're learning to chunk the sounds like this. And as they're doing so, as they're creating these categories of sound, they're losing the ability to perceive the differences within these categories. So you may have heard that Japanese people, for example, are struggling to hear the difference between ra and la, because for them, this is part of the same chunk. And there are also other examples. For example, in the Hindi language, there are two ta sounds that sound exactly the same, but that are acoustically as different as the ra and la. The only reason we don't hear that difference is because we've learned to categorize these two sounds into the ta sound. And then even in babbling, children will start producing sounds that are in their environment. So in the language or languages that they hear around them. And this early learning of sound distinctions and sound production that can explain foreign accents in late bilinguals. So if you've learned to categorize the sounds in a certain way, that starts even in the first year of life. The longer you wait before you're introduced to another sound system, the less likely it is that you'll acquire this new sound system perfectly. Okay, another unit a little bit more complex from the sounds is the words. It is a big part of language learning, so acquiring vocabulary. Babies tend to produce their first words at around 12 months of age, and this is the case for both monolinguals and bilinguals. A lot of people would say that their child is speaking later because they're bilinguals, but this is not what the data is showing. So the first words usually come around the same age in monolinguals and bilinguals. And there's usually nothing very special about the sound that is produced when the first words are being said. The only difference is the intention of meaning. So the baby might have been babbling for 6 months, going ba, 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 ba. And then one day they point at a ball and they say ba. And then we know that this is the first word because that's the first time that they try to convey meaning with the same syllable. And if bilinguals tend to acquire vocabulary around the same pace, so they will reach the 50 words milestone at around the same age. These 50 words could be a mix of 1, 2, or 3 languages. But yes, in terms of total number, they're following the same pace. Vocabulary can then become a bit lower in bilinguals if we test it in one language compared to monolinguals. That's because the lexicon, so all the words that the child knows, is often split between 2 or more languages. And it may seem like the child has a vocabulary deficit when you test them in one language only. But what is interesting here is that when you contrast school-related vocabulary, like triangle, astronaut, versus home-related vocabulary, like toothbrush, omelette, things like that, it's usually observed that the immigrant children will not show a deficit in terms of the school-related vocabulary, but may show a deficit in the majority language in terms of home-related vocabulary. Because I would argue that their vocabulary learning is adaptive. They haven't needed to learn these words. It's not part of their communication needs. And they could very well learn them later on when the need comes. And vocabulary is, of course, something that continues to develop well into adulthood, and it is improved when the child reads a lot, for example. Sentences is another level of complexity, where the first word combination, so that's the first mini sentence, usually produced around 18 months. Again, that's the same for monolinguals and bilinguals. And grammar is something that continues to develop well into adulthood. In bilinguals, there may be sometimes a borrowing of a structure from one language and then used into the other language. So that could create some grammatical errors that are typical of a bilingual population. So for example, inversing the word order. So these are kind of grammatical errors that are frequent in bilinguals. But on the plus side, there can be an advantage to bilingualism in terms of explicit learning of grammatical rules. So when you go to school, you need to learn exactly what the rule is. And this is because bilinguals had a bit more of experience of what I call meta language, so thinking about language. They had more occasions of comparing language between each other, and they tend to be a bit more aware of the language structure itself. And of course, the proficiency in language of formal education is going to influence school achievement, because reading comprehension builds on oral comprehension. So you can't read something and understand it if you don't understand the grammar and the vocabulary that is on text. But I would also argue that reading comprehension also depends greatly on the child's knowledge of the world and their understanding of people's thoughts, intentions, etc. So these are all dependent on that strong language base that I was talking about earlier. And for that reason, it is still very important that the parents use a language that they're comfortable in, even if that's not the language that is going to be used in school. Effects of bilinguals beyond language. So there are some effects of bilingualism that have been discussed a lot on cognition. So a few years ago, there's been a lot of discussion about what was labeled the bilingual advantage. And it was said that bilinguals have increased performance in cognitive tasks that require inhibition of distracting information or switching between tasks. So for example, if you look at the shapes at the top, so if you ask participants to look at shapes like these and classify them according to shapes, so they need to put the circles in one pile, the triangles in another. And then after they get used to this, you tell them, okay, now stop. Now you need to classify by color. So they need to relearn the rule and inhibit their idea of still classifying by shape. So everybody is being slowed down and makes more mistakes when they're asked to switch their task. But it has been claimed that bilinguals are less affected than monolinguals in doing a task like that. And this is where the idea of being smarter, bilinguals being smarter came from. And the reason for this is because there are some regions of the brain that are a bit like the conductor of the orchestra of the brain. And they are involved in terms of attention and control, etc. And when bilinguals speak, they activate these conductors region a bit more than monolinguals, because they need to also inhibit the other language that sometimes perhaps the word in the wrong language is coming to mind first. So this explains the results in inhibition and switching. But it's not necessarily something fantastic. It may offer an advantage in some context, but also a disadvantage in other contexts. For example, bilinguals are usually slower at finding their words because so if you're showing them cards, for example, and they need to name what's on the card, so common objects or less common objects, bilinguals will take longer to find the right word in their mind. That is also a consequence of how their brain activates for language. So nothing is black and white, and there are advantages and disadvantages. Another consequence of bilingualism that goes beyond language is in terms of culture. And here it is difficult to put anything negative on this. So the exposure to another language is opening the possibility of a better understanding of another culture. And this can be very important if that other culture is part of your family heritage. Because yeah, you can try to talk about the culture in the other language, but I would argue that a lot of a culture is lost in translation. Also, being exposed to the languages that are part of the family heritage can also increase connections with monolingual members of the family. So, for example, often the grandparents are not necessarily fluent in the language that the child is using at school, for example. So it's very worth it to have this exposure to the other language. And even with basic proficiency in the less preferred language, the seeds of biculturalism is planted, and the child could decide to grow on this and build on these basic skills to achieve higher proficiency later on, especially if they have what I labeled earlier as the strong language base. So in finishing, here are a few advices that I would give to bilingual parents or parents of bilingual children to help them with language development. So a lot of these are the same advice that you would give to parents of monolingual children. So the first one, speak to your child as much as you can to build this strong language base. So we've discussed about quantity. It's very important to involve your child in conversation. Also to read to them and encourage reading various material that will expose them to a wider vocabulary, more varied grammatical structure. And use the language you feel most comfortable in with your child, even if this is not the language your child is using at school. I think this is very important, as we've discussed, to be able to offer this rich language environment. It's also very important from an interaction point of view, because you don't want to use a language that would be awkward to use with your child. You don't want to disrupt this like emotional aspect of the parent-child interaction. Also, I would say maintain connections with the culture, the community, and speakers of a language that is less preferred by your child. So this could involve the wider family. It could involve taking ballet lessons in the community, if the community's learning is using a language that is different from the one you're using at home. And very importantly, communication should always be the central focus. So it is okay to encourage using a less preferred language, but I would say never force it, because the motivation needs to come from the child. And it can backlash if you're trying to force it on the child. So this was the slides that I prepared. I have no idea how long I've been speaking. Probably a bit too long.
Thank you, Evelyn. That was great. And 25 minutes plus, it was perfect timing. Any questions that anybody would like to ask Evelyn, or maybe share your own experiences or anecdotes? If like waiting for the questions, but I have few points that sort of like came to my mind, which would be probably very interesting. Like one is a sort of thing like you were talking about the bilingualism quite a lot, but is there such a thing that there would be sort of overload of because of too many languages when the kids are growing up? Let's say, for example, if parents are their native language are different, and then they operate in perhaps in a country where's the third language involved, or even more. Do you think that's going to have differences in relation to sort of learning the language or functioning?
So I would say there's never too many languages, but we have to also be realistic in what we expect. So being bilingual can mean very different things. Often the child will develop a dominant language, and there could be a second language with a bit less proficiency, what I would call family life proficiency. So basic conversation, that kind of thing, like home kind of vocabulary, oral grammar, which is not always the same as written grammar. And then there could be also another language that is perhaps has reached home fluency, perhaps a bit higher, perhaps also a bit lower. But I would say there's never too many languages. It will not confuse the child to have more languages. And what is there can be built on. So the only part of language where it makes a difference whether it's acquired early or late is the sounds aspect. So this is where if the child is exposed early, they shape this sound system around this language, and then they can develop the language without a foreign accent. So that's the only thing that needs to happen early on in terms of specific to a language. Everything else can be built upon later on. So even if they have an understanding of a third language, but not able to really use it to produce, they could learn that later on if they have the motivation.
Great. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe first one, yes, Yelis is asking, when you say early, is that in the first 18 months? Or what would be sort of like the time frame for it?
So it depends a lot on what we're talking about. So early in terms of sounds is usually the first year of life. The sensitive period for language, it doesn't stop abruptly. It fades out. So I would say the first 1,000 days are probably the most important. So that's roughly the first 2.5 years of life. And then school-age children are still better at learning sounds and pronunciation than adults. But yeah, there's no abrupt end to this sensitive period.
Great. And then Caroline is asking, how come siblings in the same home with the same mix of language can develop differently in their bilingualism, where one has a more primary bilingualism and another more secondary?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think there are many factors. One of them that I think matters a lot is motivation. So different kids do not have the same attraction to one language versus another, even within the same family surrounding. And I think that can have quite a big impact. Different children also have different skills for learning languages, a bit like they would, one child could find learning math easier than the other. The same also applies to learning languages. So there is this aspect of it as well. And there could be experience effects. So maybe one child wasn't spoken to in the same way, especially if there's an age gap between them. So perhaps there's some differences in their experience of the languages. But I agree, this is really interesting to see within the same family, children being following a very different bilingual journey.
Just out of curiosity, can you see it in your own children, by the way?
Yes, what I find interesting is that my children, they have different affiliation with the languages. And we had an international move about a year and a half ago, which meant that the kids are now exposed to a different type of French and a different type of English. So European French when they were used to Canadian French, and American English when they were used to British English. And the way they switch their accent is completely different between the three of them. And I can see the influence of the friends playing along in there. I think the peers have a lot of influence in school-age children and also in teenagers, of course.
Maybe there's two more questions, so let's take these if it's okay with you, Evelyn. So Emma is asking, if you are a late bilingual and someone asks a question or speaks to you in your new language, do you consciously translate it into your native language to understand?
It depends on the people. I would say this is something that disappears when fluency increases. So if you're not very fluent in a language, you may still think in your native language and then refer back to your native language whenever you hear or read something in your newer language. But this is something that really tends to disappear as you're building fluency. For example, I've had to speak about my work in French, and even though it's my native language, the one I'm using at home on a daily basis, I find this extremely difficult because I'm not used to thinking about these ideas in French.
Good, and I think Golnasi's question relates to the same point, that is it true that the person thinks basically in the first language they learned? And if so, does it hurt their thinking abilities if they have not systematically learned the grammar of that first language, for example, at school?
So I would say again that depends a lot on the context, and it could depend on the sphere of life for these people. So you could think about work in a language, but think about family life in another one. So I think that depends a lot. And whether if you've not learned your native, the explicit or written grammar of your native language, if you have not learned explicitly any grammar in school-age years, I think that can have an impact. But if you have learned that in a language, I think that's probably covered.
Okay, great. I think we can, one more last one from Caroline. Cheeky last question, quite specific, so we can address it later if needed. So Caroline is asking, do autistic bilinguals understand more small talks or metaphors than monolingual autistics? I think it's quite specific question. I don't know if you have information or sort of gut feeling about this.
I've not read any research on this specifically, but my intuition would be that they would not. I think it's not the code of language that is a difficulty in autism. So like the specific language they're using is a bit like the medium, but the problem lies beneath that. So I wouldn't hypothesize any differences, but that could be your next research project, Caroline, or an MSc or something.
Excellent. I think the time is up. Evelyn, that was very fascinating, and sort of like, oh, thank you for sharing your expertise. So we were up for a treat. And thank you for everybody attending late in the evening. And we hope to see you on 20th of January when Dr. Alice Jones will talk about tantrums and how to handle them. And this was postponed from early December. So hopefully we'll see many of you then as well. But excellent. Thank you, Evelyn, and good night, everybody.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining.